If you let your dog off the lead in the park and it goes and attacks somebody, whose fault is it? Yours or the dog's? Well, how about if you replace the dog with an AI agent and you replace the park with a task that you've asked it to complete? These kinds of questions might sound like sci-fi, but in fact, they are increasingly going to be the kinds of things that we're going to have to deal with. As AI becomes more and more complex and better at defining its own goals, we're going to have to start to understand to what degree we hold ourselves responsible versus the AI or robot. My guest this week is a specialist in exactly this kind of ethical and legal question. He is David Gunkel, a professor at Northern Illinois University and the author of various books on the ethics of emerging technologies. He's just released his latest Person, Thing, Robot, which is available through MIT Press. And I spoke to him about the various different moral, ethical, and legal quandaries that are bound up in these very serious questions about the technological evolution that we find ourselves on. I found it a really super interesting conversation, and as I say in the show, he's really made me think about a lot of these things in a way that I hadn't previously considered. So I hope you enjoy it, and without further delay, this is The Complete Tech Heads with me, Tom Edwards, and here I bring you David Gunkel.
Complete Tech Heads.
Okay, so I'm super excited to ask you about your new book, Person, Thing, Robot. So I guess first of all, to riff on the title, how do you think about defining a thing and defining a person?
Yeah, obviously it's an important question because it's the title. And really where I gather both the definition of thing and person from is from the Romans. We operate in our current legal systems with two distinct entities. Either you are a subject of the law, you're a person, or you're an object of the law, you're a thing. And that distinction comes from Gaius, who wrote a book about Roman law called the Institutes. And he basically says that we deal with two things in the law, person or thing, and as a result, this is how we sort of organize our world in terms of who counts as another subject that we have to respect and take their rights into consideration, and what is a mere thing that we are able to use and even abuse as we see fit.
And so I suppose that the premise then becomes that we are increasingly starting to blur that line, right? So I think you raised the example in the book of pets, and you might have a dog, and as a legal entity you might have some kind of grey area there because I guess it has some agency. So is that the basis of your thinking then? Is it to do with agency? Is it to do with the ability to take decisions in the real world? Is that how we have classically defined persons? And is that where the grey area is starting to become more prevalent?
So what we're encountering right now, I believe, is the inability to decide if these new socially interactive, semi-intelligent kinds of artifacts are going to be considered just things, or if we're going to have to expand the notion of person to incorporate these different kinds of artifacts. Now, to give you a good example of how we've already done this, right now, you and I live in a world where artifacts have personhood. We call those artifacts corporations. And corporations are persons not because they have feelings, not because they're conscious, not because they're sentient, but because we need to fit them into our moral and legal categorizations. We need to decide where they stand in relationship to us in social circumstances. And so I think right now we're encountering what I've called the machine question, which is, are these things or are these persons? And, how are we going to make these decisions? Should we decide right here, right now, that they're going to be things, or should we decide that we need to open up the category of person, and what are the costs and benefits of those two decisions?
And so what do you think the pressures are likely to be on us as a civilization to make that distinction?
So some of the pressures have to do with just the fact that we anthropomorphize these different devices and therefore project into them expectations and emotions and states of mind that may not be there, yet nevertheless, it's part of what makes us a social creature. It's part of what we do in interacting with others, whether it be another human person, a non-human animal, or an artifact. And therefore, being attentive to what human beings do and what human beings need as we are engaging in social interactions and relationships with artifacts is important. There's also a concern on the legal side, because we want to know what are the opportunities for assigning responsibility to AI and robots for their decision making. What are the limits of what we can do in terms of our exercise of ownership over various entities like a robot or an AI. And so what we are sort of having seen played out for us right now are a lot of challenges that are asking us whether we can fully reify these things and make them things, or whether we are going to be personifying these entities and making them something more than a thing. And so you can see how this binary that we inherited from the Romans is sort of pulling us in two different directions. And resolving this is something that's going to require not only a lot of conversation about the moral business and the ethics of this all, but a lot of legal decisions about how we want to situate these things in our legal systems so that we are able to really make decisions that are in our best interest as we move forward, working with all these various different kinds of artifacts around us.
Yeah, so you mentioned anthropomorphization, which I think is becoming more and more important now. Like you are seeing increasingly people interacting with AIs in particular in a way that is almost indistinguishable from the way that they interact with humans, right? But I guess is that almost not a kind of quirk of humans rather than a kind of way of defining things?
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
No, I agree with you exactly. It is something we do. It is something we do to each other, because I don't know that you necessarily have a conscious mind unless I, project into you my expectations from my own experience and say you must be the same because you look the same, you behave the same, right? This is Descartes' problem in the meditations, cogito ergo sum. It gets him to understand he's a thinking thing, but how is he going to be certain that everybody else is? We anthropomorphize our animals, whether it be dogs or cats, or even non-domestic animals, as we try to describe what other wild animals are or aren't doing, as the case may be. Yeah. And we anthropomorphize our artifacts. We anthropomorphize cars. We anthropomorphize musical instruments.
Buildings. Have
buildings.
You seen the building pictures that look like people?
Yeah.
I mean, they're funny, right?
They are.
This thing is so deep that it's kind of almost humorous.
So I think, one of the things you often hear from people who are sort of critical of this tendency of anthropomorphization, they'll say, well, just don't do it. Stop that. don't anthropomorphize, because that's a bad thing. Yeah. We can't stop it. It's what we do. What makes us social. It is the sort of glue of our social institutions. And so instead of looking at it as a bug that has to be eliminated, I think we got to look at it as a feature that has to be carefully managed. Managed in the design, managed in the marketing, managed in the user experience. And we don't have a lot of experience right now with anthropomorphizing of robots, because they're still pretty brand new, and we're still kind of feeling our way in the dark to decide how we want to do this. But I think if we look at it as a management problem and not a bug to be eliminated, I think we could get a better understanding of what possible futures there are for us, because it's really about us and about what we do.
Yeah. Have you ever interacted with an AI friend or any of these pretend people that are like Replica or anything like that?
Yeah, I do it all the time in my classes, because I invite my students to do this as part of their learning about this technology, and it is at times frustrating when they don't do what you expect them to do, and other times they're incredibly seductive in the way that they sort of draw you in, and you sort of forget that you're talking to a machine, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I worry. I've done a couple of videos on this. I worry about the AI girlfriend phenomenon just taking millions of people off the grid eventually, if they do become so captivating that that people prefer them to other people like that. I feel like that could be a big problem for us as a species.
I'm actually less worried about that than a lot of the kind of moral outrage that surrounds this sex robot stuff and the AI girlfriend. And that's because we have always been investing emotionally in non-real fictional artifacts. We do it when we read and we invest in a character in a book, in a novel. We do it when we go to the movies and we have a very close relationship with a particular character in a TV show or something that really touches us in a way that when they're harmed or they die or whatever, it is something that we cry and we really pushes our emotional buttons. I think we have to figure out what the balance is, and I think initially the response is, oh my God, this is horrible. People are going to do that instead of spending time going outside and playing and being with other people. Yeah. We worried this way about video games, and we kind of figured that out. We actually worried this way about books. When the novel was invented, it was the big worry was women would spend all this time reading, and they would not marry and raise families because they would fall in love with literature.
Wow.
Again, we kind of figured out literature.
Yeah.
So I think it's a matter of some experience and some good reflection on what the opportunities and challenges actually are.
Maybe we'll just incorporate them like we have with everything else. Maybe we'll have our real girlfriend and our AI girlfriend, and it'll just be normal. Who knows? Wild times. So on the question of things, then, so there are quite famous people who are having this debate around AI risk and all that stuff. Marc Andreesen being the most prominent. I'm not sure I'm sure you are aware of what he's been saying about it. He's very much saying, look, these are things. It's just technology. There is no, and he's talking in regards to AI risk particularly here, but he seems very much of that side of the argument, that it's just another technology, it's just another thing, it's just another tool, it's just another hammer, or to use your example, I believe. What's your take on that position?
Right. So these are manufactured, human-designed artifacts. They are ostensibly things. And that seems to make a whole lot of sense. It seems very reasonable, very rational, but it's coming from that very rational part of the brain. It doesn't take into account what we, again, do as social creatures. So to give you a really good example of where the line gets crossed, you take something, and again, thing being the operative word here, like Alexa. And Alexa is designed to be a tool that you utilize in vocal mode to get answers to questions and basically voice activated search. So it seems very reasonable, what that's all about. But as people have brought these things into their home, they're discovering their children and even they, human adults, are saying thank you to Alexa for the answers that she gives. Now, we don't thank the hammer for helping us build a house. We don't thank the toaster for making toast, right? It's the social presence of Alexa that changes the equation, and does it in ways that I think challenge us to rethink whether or not we can relate to these as just things, because it seems we're not doing that. And I think someone like Andreesen saying that these are just things, get over it, it sounds very reasonable, but it's not very practically oriented with regards to what actually happens when users get these things in their hands and start interacting with them on a daily basis.
Yeah. I've said thank you to Alexa, and I have thought to myself, what the hell are you doing? There's a weird cognitive dissonance there. It does start to seep into the social part of your brain in a way that you're absolutely right, in a way that most technology doesn't. So we clearly are in, because we're in the, what do they? It's like the uncanny valley now, aren't we? Right, where they're getting quite close. Like they're not quite there. Like interacting with to go back to the AI friends, replica and stuff, the main thing I notice is the short-term memory is not there. So they'll forget stuff that you said, 30 seconds ago or whatever, and then that kind of clicks, oh yeah, it's not a real person. But that'll get there, right? Like, we can't be far away.
It'll get there, but also it shows you how these things are really, in our current social environment, they're not quite things, but they're also not quite persons. They're kind of in this gray zone in between. And again, we don't have a lot of experience with things that are kind of in that in-between zone. I think the best example are domestic animals. Yeah. At one point, dogs were considered tools to assist humans in herding and hunting and all kinds of other things. And when a dog wasn't a good hunter or was gun shy, my grandfather 100 years ago would take it out back and shoot it. Why? It's a tool. It doesn't do its job, so you dispose of it. Today, that sounds barbaric, right? We would find that absolutely insane. And just 100 years later, the dog hasn't really evolved much than it was 100 years ago. But now I'm a pet parent.
Yeah,
I'm not a dog owner, right?
Yeah.
I adopt a dog. I don't buy a dog.
Yeah.
And when I do adopt a dog, they send the adoption agency over to my home to make sure my home is safe enough for the animal, right? Yeah. So what's changed is us. Our relationship with the dog has altered in a very short period of time. And now the dog is not quite a thing, but it's also not quite a person. And I think that provides us with a sort of template for how robots will sort of also push these similar boundaries and challenge us to rethink these things.
Yeah, you're totally right. I don't know if I know you're over in the UK. You've been here for a little while. I don't know if you've seen any of the news about dogs. Like, this very thing is coming up a lot in the news recently about these XL bully dogs.
Oh yeah.
They're especially aggressive dogs. Like, something like 96% of all dog-related injuries are caused by this particular breed. And there's a big debate going on about, people want to blame the owners. Some people want to blame the dogs. The government's saying you can't have this breed of dog. Some people are saying, well, it's the owner. And I guess what they're doing there is taking part in that exact debate, right? The people who are saying you blame the dog, they're making the dog a person. The people who say you blame the owner, they're making the dog a thing, right?
Correct. Yeah. And, if you push it into the legal arena, if it is your property, you are responsible for, your property. But if it has some agency that the law imparts to that object, now all of a sudden it shifts the responsibility from you to the dog. And that is what you're seeing, I think, play out in real time, is how this is going to be negotiated in the case of these particular animals.
Yeah. And so if we keep on that legal question then and move on to the technology. So we're clearly not at a stage yet where robots and AIs are taking lots of decisions in the real world autonomously, but we're going to, right? Like, that's very clear that's really not far away. And do you think that is the point at which we're really going to have a serious conversation about this, when there are decisions that they're making in the real world?
So I think this is how we sort of convince ourselves that this is not so urgent just yet. We say, well, yeah, what these questions you raise are really important, but it's going to require full, moral agency on the part of the AI or the robot. Maybe we'll get there. We're not there yet. So let's just table this for now, and we'll pick that up, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, and get into this. I think that's too late. I think we've got to start to really think about our moral and legal categories currently, because they not only relate to the robots, they relate to the things of the environment, they relate to animals, and this is all part and parcel of us really being challenged to think about the way that we organize our world in terms of these binary categories. It may be the case that what we inherited from the Romans, you're either a person or a thing, is already limited and limiting. And we may need a more fine-grained moral and legal ontology where we're able to factor into our social environment and our moral and legal decision-making processes these different kinds of entities that are not either one or the other.
One side question before I come back on that. I noticed that clearly in the title, and generally you're often talking about robot rather than about AI, and that seems different. Like, is there? There's clearly a distinction between the two things, and clearly we've had robots for a long time that don't behave autonomously. They're just actuators or whatever, an arm that lifts a thing and drops it somewhere else and doesn't do anything else. Why that choice of words? Why robot rather than AI?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question. And I think it can be answered in a couple of ways. One is that it's historically older. Robot comes to us from the 1920s out of the science fiction play written by Karl Čapek called RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots.
Wow.
The word
That's
robot...
that's a great nugget. I'll definitely clip that up.
Oh, good,
I had
okay.
no idea.
So the word robot comes from the Czech word robota, which means servant or
Right.
even slave. And so we've had, I think, a longer, at least literary history with robots than we have had with AI, which comes to us from the 1950s at the Dartmouth summer meeting. So I like robot because it is the older term, and it provides a template, I think, even for what we do with AI as that evolves later in the 20th century. Another reason I go with robot is that robot is something that people are able to recognize as being individualized, where a lot of AI systems are cloud-based and accessed through various means, but the AI is elsewhere. And I think that makes it a little abstract for individuals to really get a handle on what we mean by social presence, if it's that abstracted or abstracted away from our physical reality. Whereas robots are something that really impinge on us as a entity that we observe in front of us. But throughout the book, I sort of move back and forth between robot and AI, and sometimes I write it robot/AI to recognize that a lot of what we are talking about with these categories of person and thing will apply both to robots and AI as we make these decisions moving forward.
And I suppose that cloud-based distributed nature of large language models will presumably present a challenge all of its own, where it isn't even individualized. It's, like if you're talking about, the responsibility for an act, it could be, you might not even know what country the data center's in, right? Or it could be in many at once. Like, presumably that's going to be an even bigger challenge than the initial individualized one that you're kind of alluding to with the robots.
Yeah, no, it will definitely be so. You probably have seen the film Her. In the
Yes,
film
I
Her,
love it. Yeah.
Samantha's the operating system that is resident on his mobile device, right?
Yeah.
But it turns out that Samantha's not only having a relationship with our main character, but having a relationship with a lot of other people simultaneously, and that's because of this cloud-based presence or lack of individual presence. So even though it comes to you through this device, the AI is elsewhere, and therefore can be connected to lots of other people. It also means that we could be in a situation where one set of laws that are made, for example, in the United States for addressing these questions could be circumvented if the AI is located in the Bahamas, for example, the same way we do with financial transactions now. And so now you're talking about how do you negotiate differences in legal jurisdictions as you are looking at which laws apply where, and how we will negotiate the international relationship part of this whole business.
Yeah. I think in Her, at the end, doesn't she make friends with lots of other AIs around the universe, and then she kind of leaves him behind, right? I mean, that's going to be a wild world when the AIs are all making friends with each other and leaving us dumb apes back home.
But I think in the film it's a really remarkable moment because we are, as viewers of the film, sort of making this assumption that the mobile device that he holds in his hands is where Samantha resides, and it's not where Samantha resides. The same way that a lot of our apps that are on our mobile devices, what is on board the device is very small in terms of its memory and in terms of its programming. and that all the resources that make it do what it does are located in some cloud-based service.
Yeah.
And that means we're looking at entities that are not easily individuated the same way that we normally think of individuals.
Yeah.
And that's changing our relationship, I think, in the same way that at the end of Her, the main character realizes that Samantha's sleeping around with everybody in the world because she's in the cloud.
Yeah. Yeah. Poor guy. Imagine. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, that idea, because it's the point you're making about legal jurisdictions. I think we already see that a lot of that play out now. Like, for China are just saying now that they are talking about leading on an AI regulatory framework, right? I mean, you see it with the big social media firms, where the regulation in Europe differs wildly from regulation in the US, and so you have like things like GDPR, where they're getting, you get lots of sites that switch off in Europe, and then they kind of have to negotiate some way to come back. You have these big fines for Google that are led by the EU. As this technology becomes more ubiquitous and increasingly more useful and valuable, I mean, do you anticipate those issues becoming even more tricky to deal with?
Yeah, I do. But it's interesting because I think oftentimes we look at that differences in jurisdictions as being a real big problem, because the way China will do something will be different than the way the EU does something, will be different from the way the US does something. But I think in dealing with a lot of these questions that we're confronting right now with AI and robots, this diversity might actually be a good thing, because like biodiversity, it's a way that we can experiment with different ways of sorting out these questions and making decisions that will help, I think, build a conversation around the best means of developing a regulatory and policy framework, because no one country is going to get it 100% right. And I think if we're sort of seeing different versions, that may actually, just like biodiversity, build in some sort of regulatory diversity that we can draw on, assuming, of course, that we learn from each other. That's not necessarily always the case.
Yeah, it's more difficult to do where China's concerned, I think, than US and Europe. Yeah, I mean, I often think, I don't know if you think much about doomerism and like AI risk, X risk, P doom, all of this sort of stuff. I often think about that, the risk of ASI killing us all, basically. I often think that diversity, competition, capitalism might actually be our savior on that front, because I think where you've got lots of different AI companies doing really amazing things, competing with one another, it's going to make it difficult for one to rise very, very quickly above all others and kind of take them all out, right? So, like, do you ever think about that diversity of different models and businesses making them?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. There's something for us in terms of good outcomes with regards to having a wider range of players.
Yeah,
developing these tools and these technologies. And that's because you can have not only competition, which can drive innovation, and that's useful, but you can also have just different ways of seeing what's possible. What worries me, I think, right now is we see a real accumulation of the power over these algorithms and these systems in the hands of a few. You've got your Googles, your Amazons, your Alibabas, and you don't have a great deal of smaller players. There are, a few here and there, but I mean, everyone's talking Chat GPT. There are other large language models, but everyone's talking about the OpenAI product, right? Yeah. And so I think I'm not worried so much about corporate players working in this field and developing the research. I'm worried about monopolization and the way one player can accumulate a lot of the power to see, where this goes and how it develops forward. So, yeah, I think the diversity could be really very useful. I think, one of the things we had prior to a lot of the recent innovations from a lot of the large tech companies is that in academia, you had every lab was doing something, and they were, putting out different ideas and different approaches. And I think that's a thing to shoot for, because there you had a lot of diversity.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that the so I spoke to a guy called Joseph Jacks recently, who's a venture capitalist in open source tech, and so he's very strongly of the opinion, obviously as you'd imagine, that we should maintain as open source an outlook. He actually calls it open weights, not open source, because of a quirk of the way that it's built. It's actually not source code. It's probability weights. That's another
Yeah, right.
story altogether. But his position was that essentially Sam Altman's sort of a plea for regulation and taking investment from Microsoft, making it less open, is essentially just shooting for regulatory capture and like going straight for a monopoly and to kind of pull up the ladder now that he's got this huge user base. Is that a concern that you would share, do you think?
Yeah, I have a big concern of regulatory capture and also ethics washing. I think both are ways.
On ethics washing.
I think both are ways in which industry can really create an environment where government is unable to do what government is good at. The reason you want regulation, the reason you want policy, is to balance where you have inequities of power. And when you have large tech companies with a lot of money developing products in almost a monopoly kind of scenario, it means that they have all the power, and those of us who are users of their services or their products do not have a great deal of power in the marketplace. And so one of the things government can do is through regulation, it can sort of balance that out a little bit so that the people have some power in deciding how things are used, where, why, and what it all means. And right now, if you look at what's happening, especially in the US, who's going to Washington to talk to regulators about regulating these technologies? It's the CEOs of the big tech companies.
Yeah.
And so I do worry about regulatory capture in that case, because they are going to ask for Congress to make regulations that foster their industry, that foster their ability to develop their products, their services, and may not, be thinking about what's best for the citizens of the United States.
Yeah.
It would be good if at those meetings you had representatives of labor unions and representatives of different workers groups and churches and you name it. I think we all
Open
need
source developers, maybe.
Yeah, that too. We need all stakeholders have to have a seat at the table. And right now, we've not had a very large enough table, at least in terms of who's going to Washington and sitting before the Congress people.
Sure. And do you have a position on AI risk, like the risk of artificial superintelligence and, like doomerism more broadly?
So I think the whole notion of superintelligence and artificial general intelligence, it's a nice sort of science fiction idea that we can think about. I think its practicalities and realities are much more limited.
Okay.
I don't think we're racing towards a future in which the AI is going to take over and turn us into slaves.
Okay. That's positive. Cause for optimism.
Yeah, I think what we're doing, and so this is a suggestion I've made for a while now, we might need to replace the A in artificial intelligence with the word alien. We're creating alien intelligence. It's not like us. It does things we can't do. Yeah. Again, I go back to animals. Why do human beings domesticate various animals like dogs? It's because dogs do things we can't do. We didn't domesticate dogs because we want them to be as intelligent or more intelligent than us. We domesticated them because they can sniff out bombs. They can find children that have, been lost in the forest. They can do things that we just are incapable of doing on our own. And I think a lot of the things that we are building that we call AI are actually kinds of alien intelligences that are able to do things that we are unable to do. For example, find a carcinoma cell in vast amounts of data where the doctors who are doing the diagnosis don't have the ability to look at that much stuff, right? Or with NASA crunching all the information they get from their satellites and deep space probes, where looking at all of that data, again, would be beyond human comprehension. So I think that's what we're looking at. We're looking at this sort of partnering with AI and not replacement.
Yeah, well, I mean that's positive, and you actually are actually falling closer on the Marc Andreesen side of the argument, I think, in that regard.
Yeah,
it's not, sounds like you're more of a techno-optimist in certainly in the doomerism sense, anyway.
Yeah, and I worry, and I'm not the only person who have said this, but I do worry that the doomerist rhetoric does create a kind of emergency, right? This is a huge problem. We got to fix it now. We got to get out in front of it, and that causes us to sort of maybe miss other things that are crucial right now, and maybe even more practical given where we currently sit in time.
Yeah, and also potentially, an excuse for regulatory capture as well.
Yes.
I think there's that, that sense of emergency is felt in Washington, it's felt in Westminster as well, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, you see it being mobilized by a lot of the big players in this arena.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so look, let's talk a bit about your position in terms of what we should be thinking about from a legal standpoint. So, when we talk about this different categorization, are you saying we should be creating new categories? Should we be creating one intermediary category? Should there be different categories for cloud versus, sealed off robotic units? Like, how do you believe this legality around AI and robotics should proceed in future?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. It really gets to the final parts of the book. So if we only have these two categories, person and thing, so the question is, okay, if we can't fit the robot into the category of thing very neatly, and we can't fit the robot into the category of person very neatly, what do we do? What's the outcome? So there's been a number of proposals that have been put out there. One rather weird one, but it's very popular, is that we need a third category in between robot and person. And that sounds like a pretty reasonable way of thinking. When you got two extremes, you find the radical middle and you come up with some sort of in-between category. The only problem is that we do have an in-between category. The Romans already had it, and that's the slave.
Right.
And so slaves in Roman times were things, property, that could also act as persons in business transactions. So there's a number of legal scholars that are suggesting that all we would need to do to solve this problem is reactualize the Roman slave laws and make it apply to robots. And interestingly, it's mainly white guys that propose this idea. But the problem is, the real problem is that this idea is being proposed by people who are occupying the position of the master, forgetting the legacy of human slavery and that there are other people on the other side of this equation who have suffered the devastating consequences of slavery across generations. Sure. And I'm not worried about what the robot is going to feel. I'm worried about what we will be creating for ourselves if we allow us to become masters, basically.
Sure.
So that's one solution. Another solution is to create what's called a kind of gradient theory of personhood, where you don't have just one category of person, but you have different range of categories of person, and that we could plug the robot into any number of different positions in this sort of gradient theory. And that's a way of taking the binary and saying, let's make it more analog. Let's make it not either or, but let's make it, kind of either or, but a lot of stuff in between that we could occupy. And that obviously would be a reasonable solution, and it's one that's going to take a considerable amount of legal effort to decide, what these new categories are and how they're going to operate. But that's a fairly credible response. My response is to basically deconstruct the opposition between thing and person and recognize that we're all things. Like we all, sort of not just, I'm not trying to flatten the ontology, but just to recognize that we are all physically embodied things in this universe. And that if we recognize our relationship, our kinship with all of these different things around us and not see ourselves as somehow really special, but more of a member of this family of things, we will have a better relationship not only to the technology, but also to the environment, also to the animals, where the idea of human exceptionalism has really excluded various things in elevating ourselves to a kind of special status. And it might be that we could learn something from especially indigenous cosmologies, where we occupy a position in a circle of kinship, where all of us occupy this fragile planet, and we all have certain expectations of the other entities that we encounter here, but that we all bear responsibility for how we respond to the others, whether it be another human person, another human animal, a tree, or even an artifact, and how that bears on not only our current condition, but also on our futures.
So, I was going to come on to ask you about rights versus responsibilities in the law and in this. I guess the immediate response to that, though, would be that I feel like humans are exceptional in that we would feel, we would allocate a degree of responsibility to a human that we would never allocate to a dog, right? Like if a dog runs and if I as a human saw a squirrel in the park and shot it dead, you would think, well, that's a really awful thing to do. You'd give me some responsibility for it. If my dog went and chased a squirrel and killed it, you wouldn't, expect the dog to be responsible for that in the same way. So is that not a challenge to that kind of perspective?
Well, it's not a difficult challenge insofar as we're already assigning responsibility to non-human entities, right? We already give corporations a certain set of responsibilities that they have to fulfill, both morally and legally. And we're able to sort of figure that out. The fact is that law is really, it's our game. We invented it, right? It's our social construct. And so we bear the responsibility for setting the rules, but we also bear the responsibility for making sure those rules are applied equitably and justly to the wide range of different entities that we are encountered with. And we are not just stacking the deck in our favor.
So if we imagine a future then where we're all things, and the AI, we'll take any AI you care to name. Are we then saying that the AI should bear responsibility for its actions in the same way that a human does under the law?
So a lot depends on what AI we're talking about, right? I mean, clearly, if it's today's large language model, it's not going to, really push much in that direction.
Let's say GPT-9. Right, so it's beyond human intelligence. It's way beyond the Turing test, and it can interact in a way that's as convincing as, if not superior to, a human.
So I think it comes down to how we want to design our social environment, how we want to create the social world that we occupy. Remember, in the 19th century, we made corporations persons, not because we cared about corporations and what they might think and feel. We did it because we needed to have a way to sue corporations for bad outcomes, and to insulate shareholders from liability when a suit is brought by a consumer who is harmed by a product, for example. And it's this kind of very mundane, very practical, very pragmatic decision-making that's going to really drive what happens here. It's not going to be some sort of big metaphysical event where we say, oh, superintelligence is here today, so we've got to figure out how it feels or doesn't feel. It's going to be much more on a case-by-case basis as courts and legislatures around the world decide what kind of world we're creating when these entities are taking a greater role in our everyday social interactions. And just like the corporation, there may be a point at which we find ourselves having to confront the question of, will we hold the AI responsible for certain decisions and outcomes? And it's not going to be, again, a one-size-fits-all. It's going to be, in this case, how are we going to decide this? How is it going to apply to this particular challenge? And then over time, we'll develop some precedent around various forms of AI and evolve a kind of regulatory environment that will respond to that. None of these things happen quickly. Technology moves at light speed, but law moves at pen and paper speed, and it will take a while for us to recalibrate to fit these things. But in my mind, this is not really about the technologies. They will be what they are, and they will develop the way they develop. For me, the real pressure is on us. Like, what are we going to do in response to the challenges and the opportunities that we are facing with regards to these innovations?
I think the reason I The reason I ask, I think, is that there is a very big question that will face us quite soon with the tech. So I know I completely understand everything you're saying about this is the way that we respond to this technology, but I think there will be a future quite soon in which, essentially the AIs begin mapping goals to actions, right? So this is what, like, I had Liron Shapira on. I don't know if you're aware of him. He talks about AI a lot, on Twitter, talking about how they're action goal mapping machines. And so you have these instrumental goals. As the tasks we ask AIs to complete become increasingly complex, they're not just one task anymore. They will start breaking them up into smaller tasks and going about achieving all of those different outcomes before they get to the final goal, which is what the human has asked it to achieve. And so the reason I ask is that the AI risk point of view is that we are going to have less and less control over those instrumental goals, those intermediate goals on the way to achieving the one that we've asked it to do. And therefore, I think we're going to increasingly get into a position where AIs are doing more and more stuff that we haven't asked them to do for reasons through inferring our wants, through inferring what we've, the nuance of what we've asked it to do. And so that, I think, is potentially where this could become very interesting, is who bears responsibility for the instrumental goal.
Right. And you can see already how this is happening even before we get to some sort of speculative future with AI. It used to be that we made decisions about what we watched on TV. We don't anymore, right? I mean, now we go to Netflix and Netflix tells us what we would like to watch. It used to be that we made decisions about what music we liked, and we went and bought new things and tried them out and talked to our friends and read maybe music critics to find out what new band we might like. Now Spotify does that for us, right? These recommendation algorithms learn our consumer behaviors. It's a pattern that can be mapped very easily and manipulated, and they are able to, with the algorithm, pretty much, and the reason why it works is we like it, right? We see this new movie that Netflix tells us we're going to like, and we're like, oh yeah, I like this new movie. Yeah, and we hear this new song from this band we never heard of before, and it's like, oh yeah, this is music I like. Yeah, this is, and so this is how the robot invasion happens. It doesn't happen with ray guns and with the uprising and all the stuff science fiction has told us about. It happens through this very slow incursion where we turn over more and more of our decision-making capabilities to these algorithms and these robots that are doing things that we find very valuable, we find very convenient and very useful. But I think again, it's on the human side. We need to decide when and where we want to limit these things. What are the guardrails? Do we want guardrails? Otherwise, we are like Narcissus, getting, entranced by our own image and losing ourselves in that reflection. Yeah. And I don't know that we have, the critical capability just yet, because, even with my students, I ask them, do you mind being told what movie to watch? And they're like, oh, that's not a problem. I like these movies, right? So I think we have to build a sort of a critical capability in each individual so that we are able to keep track of what is changing and how. But we also need to empower government to step in where there are situations where we have imbalances in power. Because this is really about power, right? I mean, this is about how power is being moved from one aspect of the consumer-product relationship to another aspect of the consumer-product relationship. And one way that you control for power is with regulation and policy. And so I think using regulation and policy as a way of ensuring human flourishing at a time when we are facing all of these incursions into our world by these machines is absolutely crucial. And, again, it's for us to decide.
Yeah. I think the recommendation algorithm example is really good. Because I think if you, like you mentioned Netflix, but if you take like Facebook, for example, newsfeed is a recommendation algorithm as well. And you think, well, okay, we all we don't love using Facebook, but we use it. We find it very sticky. I mean, who bears responsibility for any downstream impact that Facebook's recommendation algorithm has on wider society, on democracy? So I guess you are right in that sense that we're already grappling with these issues, whether we like it or not, right?
Right. And this is why I said we have to do this now. We can't wait for that speculative future where we've got the super intelligent AI or whatever. We've got to look at the really tiny things that are happening currently that seem so mundane and so almost invisible. The way I explain it often is the robot invasion or the robot uprising won't look like science fiction. It's going to look like the fall of Rome. The way Rome fell is the Romans invited the barbarians in to their society and turned over more and more administrative tasks to the barbarians. And one day, Rome was gone.
God. So that's what we're gonna. So what you're saying is I shouldn't give that task to ChatGPT to do. I should write it myself.
Well, I mean,
lest I herald the downfall of civilization.
Yeah. So
unwittingly.
This is, I mean, it really is a crucial human decision. Like, we can decide what powers to turn over to the algorithm, and we can decide when not to. And I don't know that we have a good sense just yet, individually or communally, as to what we want this to look like.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, I think if anything, the surveys I've seen, most when they survey the public at large, most people don't want any more AI advancement, which I also don't personally agree with. I was speaking to a founder of a male breast cancer charity last week he's a breast cancer survivor himself. We're talking about male breast cancer. I didn't even know it existed, but we were talking about the technology roadmap for cancer. And when you think about how the scope of technology in medical science alone, you almost get to a place where you start thinking, well, can it be ethical to hold it back at all? How many millions of lives could we save if we just accelerated straight through and regulated later? We could, I believe we could cure cancer within decades, not centuries. So I think you do bump up against these questions, but I guess there are other risks inherent in doing so. Accelerationism has its downsides, I guess.
I think another problem is that when you're looking for the AI, the notion people have in their brains is of the super intelligent stuff, the AGI stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of what is happening right now with, for example, recommendation algorithms. I ask my students, for example, do you think recommendation algorithms are AI? The answer, no. So they're looking for a problem that isn't there yet and missing the problem that is here right now.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got to be really focused on what we mean when we say AI, and what is actually happening with a lot of this tech innovation that oftentimes flies under the radar because it doesn't qualify as AI, capital A, capital I.
Yeah, it's just a smooth curve of technology. I was listening to Sam Altman on the Joe Rogan podcast. He was, I listen to Sam Altman whenever he does interviews. To be honest, I think he's like the guy that's changing the world more than anyone else right now. But he talks about this. It's a smooth curve, and we've been on it for years, and we're only at the at the bottom of it. It's a smooth exponential, and we've been on it for far longer than we realise. And it's not just suddenly gonna. It's never going to be a right angle. It's just going to accelerate faster and faster.
Which is why, I really try to encourage people to think about these bigger questions about law and ethics now, because we're at the beginning stage of something that's only going to, accelerate in various ways. And if we can get a handle on the small things, we have a chance of getting a handle on the big things. But if we wait until the big things are here, we've already have made decisions by default about our, possible future, and keeping an eye on what is changing, how it's changing, where it's changing in real time, I think is the real challenge for us.
Well, look, David, you've been very generous with your time, and I think we're running up against it now. Briefly before we wrap, is there anything that you would like to get across from your position on this that perhaps I haven't asked about, or that we haven't covered?
No, I think we've covered almost all of it. I would just reemphasize the fact that I think a lot of this we often think is about the AI and the robots, but in my mind, this is really about us. It's about how we decide our future individually and together. And that is something that I think is our responsibility. And I would just emphasize that my concern is what are we doing to respond to these challenges and these opportunities?
Awesome. Well, look, the book Person Thing Robot is out now. So most of my listeners are UK and US. Where can they pick it up? All good bookstores?
So here's the really good news. If you want a physical copy, yes, please go to a bookstore and purchase from a bookstore. But MIT has released the book open access, which means you can download it for free from the MIT Press website.
Awesome. Well,
It'll give you a PDF and you can read it immediately.
Perfect. I have that link, and I will make sure to put it in the show notes. So anyone listening or watching, you can find the link right there. Well, look, in that case then, thank you so much for your time. It's been a super interesting conversation. You've made me think about a lot of these issues in ways that I most certainly had not previously considered. So yeah, it's been great. Thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a very nice conversation.
Complete tech.